I'm just as surprised as you are that she sat for that photo. I don't know if you can see or if she's off camera, but there's Lily. Hello and welcome back. This week I'm really excited because I'm reviewing Hannah's War by Jan Eliasberg. Hopefully you got to see my author interview with her on my blog yesterday. If not, I'll put the link to that down below. So this is a historical fiction piece taking place in part during Berlin 1938 and New Mexico 1945. And it follows Dr. Hannah Weiss, who is an Austrian physicist. And now Hannah is loosely based on the real-life Dr. Lise Mittner, who, according to Eliasberg, and of course I just skipped the page, it was her story buried in the back pages of the New York Times that inspired me to begin this journey. I hope Hannah's War does Dr. Mittner justice and gives her some of the recognition she so richly deserves. So Mittner, just like the fictional Weiss, is involved in the Manhattan Project, which was, for those of you who don't know, or maybe those of you who fell asleep that day in American history, they were the ones who developed the atomic bomb during World War II, which more or less ended the war depending on who you talk to. So, it's fascinating. We start off in media res, and it's first person perspective from Hannah, and she's being forced into an MP vehicle of some sort, but we don't really know what's going on yet. Then, most of the rest of the book flips back and forth between a third-person perspective of Hannah in New Mexico and then Hannah in Berlin in the 30s. And so it's just this really fascinating juxtaposition of her scientific and a little bit romantic relationship with fictionalized Dr. Stephen Fry, and the romantic tension and sort of professional relationship with the investigator, Major Jack Delaney. Now, Jack Delaney has some secrets of his own, and he's tasked with uncovering Hannah's, but she's also kind of uncovering his at the same time. And so between that and the fact that apparently she's just this beautiful woman that nobody else on the base has ever really been able to get close to, it just provides for some really interesting, dramatic, engaging interactions. Like, I love, oh, and I should have marked it, but there's this part in, well, there are numerous parts really, so it would have been difficult to mark. There's this part where she's walking and Jack joins her and they're talking and he's like, "You're a terrible liar," or whatever, and they're slowly becoming slightly more vulnerable, but then they're interrupted. And then later on in a cafe, she's like, "Well, I'll tell you the truth." And they become even more vulnerable. And I loved when Jack finally opens up to her, because you can tell that he's not actually as rough and tough as he appears on the outside. And so seeing that character development, even though it was very brief, was just great. Now, on the note of telling truth, like I said, it is split between two different time periods. 3 if you count a very brief flashback into Jack's own history. But anyway, most of the book is arguably taking place in New Mexico 1945, but when Jack Delaney is interviewing Hannah and trying to figure out what is the truth, why is she here, is she a spy, oh hello Lily, that's usually when they go back in time to Berlin. And then we get to see this really fascinating relationship between Fry, Hannah, and then some of the other scientists, because, and that's where it's really heartbreaking. In the Berlin sections of the book, there's very clear anti-Semitism because Hannah is Jewish. Whereas in the 1940s, there's a little bit of that, but it's mostly just sexism because they're like, how could a woman? So 1938 Berlin parts of the book are just frustrating to read, but like, even though you're kind of frustrated because you're like, why are they so unjust and why are they like this, the general like interactions of the characters are just really fascinating. I'm sorry for that car passing through. And I really enjoyed it. It's a page turner. The chapters aren't very long. I think it's really well paced. At first I didn't love that there wasn't much of a warning with the temporal shifts, but as you get into the book a little bit more, it's almost easier to anticipate, because they're like, okay, now tell me the truth, or like, she sat back and remembered blah blah blah, or something like that. But also, I just really love the way Elias Berg writes. Like, there's this really romantic scene, and I didn't mark the chapter, in my copy it's pages 198 and 199, chapter 32, where they're talking a little bit more about Stephen Fry, who's a Gentile, and Hannah's relationship, because he has just helped her escape, and they're trying to figure out the science behind the bomb, and this is before she even is part of the Manhattan Project. And it's so good, you guys. Like, there's this bit where it says, for 3 days, the cycle of science and sex and science fed into each other to a cyclonic effect. There was no part of Hannah that Stefan was reluctant to touch her taste, and no part of Stefan exempt from Hannah's diligent experimentation. In the lab and in the bed, he made her laugh, made her feel more certain of herself. And it just kind of goes on to see this really, again, vulnerable side of Hannah that you don't really get to see with Jack. And so it just makes her that much more of a complex character. And I love, it's not quite slow burn because of the temporal shifts. And also you can kind of tell from the get-go that there's like that element of attraction. But I just love the description of how intimate they are. Not even in the sense of sex, but just how, in terms of respect of each other's intellect, it was so good. And in between Jack and Hannah, I just love, again, the intimacy of their bearing the truth to each other. Because for Jack, he's kind of faking his identity a little bit. And had he not, he wouldn't have been so successful and risen to the rank of major, probably. And with Hannah, like, she's just constantly being underestimated, both because of her sex and because of her faith, which is so frustrating. But I love that they kind of find this common ground between them. And there's this part at the end, I really need to get better about marking these, but basically Jack's like, if we would have met in another life, I would have, and Hannah's like, I know, and I would have let you. And I think that's just so beautiful. So I definitely recommend Hannah's War. It's a great historical fiction piece. I love the fact that it's based off of a true story, no matter how loosely that basis is, just because I think it gives a really fascinating look into history that you don't normally get to see. And I think the other powerful thing about historical fiction is that it opens up pathways, because even if you're just reading Hannah's War for the tension between the characters, it might inspire you to look more into Dr. Lise Meitner. It might inspire you to look more into the Manhattan Project, or everything that the Nazis did with the ghettos and the disappearances. Like, it's just such a good stepping stone to learn more. And I love learning, and so that's just one more reason why I loved this book and this genre in general. So that's all I have for Hannah's War. Next week, we're continuing with the historical note. We're going to be reviewing Brad Meltzer and John Mensch's The First Conspiracy. It's the secret plot to kill George Washington. I picked it up a while ago, and I'm not very far into it, as you can see. So far, though, really fascinating. Gives me a little bit more insight into some revolutionary activity than I ever knew before. So I'll get back to you next week with my thoughts on this, and I'll see y'all next time. In the meantime, happy reading, and thanks.